Welcome to the next section. In this one, we will keep exploring fundamental React topics and finally make our components do something. So we will make components interactive now. So to do that, we will start learning how to handle events in React and how to update the user interface using the extremely important concept of state. We'll also start building our next project, where we're gonna focus on state and on building forms in the React way using controlled elements. By the end of the section, we'll summarize everything we have learned about props and state, both in theory and in practice, by building a really nice small flashcards application. So once again, a super essential and foundational section for you. And so let's move on right away. So in this section, we will start to learn about events and state by building a very simple component where we can navigate through a few steps. And so let's now, in this lecture, start by building out the static part of that component. Now, in order to build that component, we will actually create a brand new project using Create React App. So if you're on Windows, go ahead and open up your command prompt. And if you're on a Mac, then just open your terminal. And remember that in the terminal, you're always in a folder. So you can see what folder that is here in your command prompt. And then from there, just navigate to the folder where you want to create your new projects. And for me, that is, again, the desktop. So remember that you can see all the folders that you can navigate to from here. So I am here in this home folder, basically. And so I can navigate to any one of these. And so that's what I'm going to do with CD. And just by the way, again on Windows, that's dir instead of ls. But anyway, I will now navigate to the desktop. And so now here, let's create our new project. So that's npx create-react-app. And now here, remember to log in the version number 5, just so we are all building the same thing here. So using the same versions. And then I will simply name this project here steps. So then hit enter, and then Create React App is doing its thing. And in the meantime, let's actually check out the component that we are going to build. So that's this one right here. So it's basically this component where we have these 3 steps. And as I said in the beginning, we can basically navigate through them by clicking here on these buttons. So when we click next, we go to step number 2. And so then we get apply to jobs. So first we had learn React, then apply to jobs, and then invest all your new income. So we can click these buttons here. So we have some interactivity here, and we can then also close and open up this component again. All right. So again, in this lecture, we will start by building out the static part of this component. So just the component, basically without any interactivity. So just writing the JSX. But anyway, Create React App has now finished. I will just quickly again rename the folder here. And then let's drag and drop it here onto VS Code. And as always, you can also open it right here. Okay, so let's clean up our starter files a little bit. And in fact, I will delete almost everything here. So we will just leave app.js and index.js. So all of them can go to the trash. And now let's open up index.js. Now this time, we will actually not write all of this here again by hand, because now you already know how that works. And so we can basically keep the code here that Create React App put there for us. We just need to get rid of this part and also of this import. Now we also got rid of the index.css file. So this import right now doesn't work, but I do actually have a CSS file in the starter files. So let's open up the files that we downloaded in the beginning. Then here in the steps starter files, we have these two. So let's copy them. And then in steps, let's place them here in the source. And then let's also just move this vanilla.html into the public. So we're going to check out later what that is. Okay, then going back here, notice how we are importing this app from this file app.js. And so that's this one. But here let's clean everything and let's once again start from scratch by creating a new component. And as always, that component will be the app component. So function app. And so you see that usually we use a component called app as the root component of our application. So basically as a component that is the parent component of all the other components. Let's just return something here. Hello React. And finally, all we have to do is to export this function from here. So export default, so that now index.js can import it here and render it into the DOM. So just, again, like we wrote before by hand, but now we will just leave the code here. Of course, we don't always have to do everything manually. Now let's come here to our integrated VS Code terminal. So just by clicking here, and as you see, this is already automatically in our project folder, or at least it should be. So now there's no need to navigate anywhere. All we need to do to start the project is to run npm start. So this will then automatically open up a new browser tab. And yeah, here it is. So this is the content of our app.js. All right. Just giving ourselves a bit more space here. And so you notice that the file name here, app.js, is exactly the name of the component. And so this is going to be a pattern that we will see throughout the course. But anyway, let's now together write the JSX here so that we end up with something like this. Again, just without the interactivity. So we actually start with a div that has the class name of steps. And if you're interested in the CSS, then of course make sure to check out the CSS file that we just included. And now this div here has 3 child elements. So it has a div with the class of numbers. And so here we will have these numbers 1, 2, 3. And now to make this a bit faster, I will just duplicate the code here, which, as I explained to you before, we can simply do with this command here. So copy line down. I think I actually personalized this command right here. So for you, it is probably another one, but you should see which one it is right here. And if you want, you can also personalize all your shortcuts right here. Okay. But anyway, let's now move on to the next one. And here we actually want a paragraph. So a paragraph with the class name of message. Let's just use a placeholder for now. And then finally, a div again for the buttons. So here we then will have one button element. Let's see. Yeah, this first one says previous. And then another one which says next. So here, basically we have the numbers, then the message and the buttons. And so what we have here is already looking pretty close to that. Now the buttons here are not purple like in the demo, and that's because we will later have another button which should not have that background color. And so let's add those stylings here directly to the 2 buttons. And so with this, we can then also practice again how we add styles to some individual JSX elements. So remember that we do that by passing in basically the style prop into this element. So then we enter JavaScript mode, and then here we can define our object of styles. So background color And here the color is 7950F2. And also the text color, let's set it to white, which is FFF, and it needs to be a string, of course, since again, this is just a JavaScript object. Now, in case you're wondering why these colors are so nicely highlighted, that's simply because I have this extension called Color Highlight. So a very popular one with 5 million installs. And so if you want to replicate the way this looks, then you can just also install that. But here, let's just copy all of this to make it faster. Next. And yeah, that's looking pretty close. All we are missing now is the highlight here of the current step. So here we are in step number 1, and therefore it is now highlighted with this purple color. And for that we have yet another class name. So class of active. Okay. Now finally, let's also add the message here. And those messages are actually in the CSS file that I provided for you. So I placed this JavaScript object here as a comment. And so let's paste that out here outside of the component. So this data doesn't depend on anything that is inside the component, and so it should be located outside, because otherwise each time that this function here is executed, this data, so this array, will be created again. But we will learn all about that a bit later, of course. So when objects are created and when these functions are executed and so on. So right now we are only learning really how we use these React features, but not yet how they work behind the scenes. So the mechanics of React are still a bit hidden to us. We are only just learning how we use the different features. Right? So now we need this message here, basically. So the first element of the array right here. But we're not going to just copy it, right? So we want to read it dynamically. And so let's here inside this component define a variable which will tell us which step we are currently in. So let's do const step and let's just set it to 1. And by the way, it is this step here that we will want to update later as we click on these buttons. But for now, we are just building here the static part. So we are just manually setting it to 1. So then let's write step and then the number of the step. And then let's read the value out of the array. So that's messages at position step. And we need the -1 here because, of course, the array is 0 based. All right. Beautiful. So if we now manually change it here to 2, then that will then change the message here. But what didn't change is that this step number 2 was not marked as active. So basically we need to now set the styles here on these elements conditionally. So if we just add the class name active to all of them, then they would always be active. But that's not what we want. So we need to basically determine this string here based on a condition. So just like we learned in the previous section. So let's enter JavaScript mode so that we can write a template literal. And so here we will then produce either active or nothing. So let's enter the JavaScript mode basically of the template literal. And then let's just ask if the step is greater or equal 1. And if so, then the result of the operation should be the string of active. And if not, well, then just nothing. So you see that this one here already became purple. And so that's, of course, because 2 is greater than 1. All right, but let's add this to all of them. But then here, of course, we need to adapt. And yeah, nice, that's working. So if we had number 3, then all 3 of them would become active. All right, and let's just quickly check this out. So you see now this one has the class of active, and these ones still have the class attribute because we specified it here, but then there is no string to it. So that's basically just this empty string that we return in these two cases. Great, so that's the static part of the application, but of course we want to now navigate here by clicking on these buttons. So not changing manually here this step variable, right? And so that means that it's now time to learn how we can handle the click events on these buttons. And so that's what the next lecture is going to be all about. Handling events in React is actually pretty straightforward. And so let's now learn how it's done. So as you can imagine, we are not going to use the addEventListener method here because that is the imperative way of building UIs. But here in React, we use a more declarative approach. So we do not manually select DOM elements, and so therefore we do also not use addEventListener. Instead, we use something similar to the HTML inline event listener. So instead, in React, we do something very similar to the HTML inline event listener. So basically, we will directly listen for the event right on the element where they will happen. So right here on the button, for example, we can use the onClick prop, and then we simply specify a function here. So the click is the event name, and then we always prefix it with the on, and then we need to write it in camel case. While in inline HTML, we would write it like this. So like this, and then specifying a string. So no camel case, but this is not HTML, it is JSX. And so it's slightly different, just as we learned before in the lecture about the rules on JSX. So again, we will pass in here now a function, and that function will then be executed whenever there is a click happening on this DOM element. So in this case, on this button right here. So let's create a quick arrow function here. And all I'm going to do now is to alert something. Let's say previous. And this should already be working. So if I click here now, then yes, we get the alert that is saying previous. And we can do the same thing on the other button. And here we say next. And so of course, then here we will get a different message. And that's essentially it. So this is how we handle events the React way. No addEventListeners, but instead we specify an event listener function directly on the element using, in this case, the onClick prop. But it could be any other event as well. So we can specify another event handler. So let's use the onMouse enter. And so now here again, we need to specify a function. And it's really, really important to understand that it is not a function call, but really a function. So we cannot simply write alert test, for example, because watch what happens now as I save. So you see, immediately we got this test right here, and not when I hover over the button. So why is that? Well, basically, as soon as React initializes this component, so when it first calls this app function, it will then see this code. And so here we are calling alert. And so then that's exactly what it does. React will read this code, and then here it finds this function call. And so it will immediately call this function. But again, that's not what we want. We want to basically define a callback function, which will be called at a later time. And that later time is in this case when the mouse enters this element. So you see that now nothing happened, but as soon as the mouse hovers here, then this function is called. So this function is called, and then we get our alert. So again, very, very important. Do not call a function here, but really specify a function value. Somehow we got that again here, but never mind. So this was just a test anyway. Let's get rid of this. This was just to show you that we can listen, of course, to more than just the click event. Now, usually we do not directly define the event handler function right here in the onClick prop, but instead we create a separate function and then pass that function in here. So let's do that now. And so usually we create those event handler functions right here in the component. So that's something new that we haven't done before, but that's perfectly fine. We can define any functions that we want here right inside the component body. And let's call this one handle previous. And this handle part here in the event handler function is pretty standard in React development. So you will see this all the time. And so then you know immediately that this function is an event handler function that is probably being used somewhere in the JSX of that component. In this case, it's going to be used right here. So handle previous. And what we want to do here, again for now, is just to alert previous. So if we click here now, that's going to work still. Great. And once again, really, really important to notice that here we are just passing in the function value. So we are not calling it, because if we were calling it, then again, we would immediately see that previous. So React would then immediately run this code here as it sees it. All right. But like this, we are only passing in the function. Or of course, we could also do this. But of course, that's very redundant. So now we are back to just having a function here, right? It's just a function that calls another one. So that's not very effective, but sometimes we will have to do something similar. But for now, this is the way that makes sense. And so let's now quickly create another one. So again, this is usually the way we do it. So creating a function which starts with handle, and then we simply pass that function here into the onClick prop or any other prop that we can use to handle some other event. All right, just to make sure that it works, and indeed it does. Great. So this is how we handle events typically in React. But of course, now we actually want something meaningful to happen here. And in particular, we want to basically change this step value here, right? And for that, we need something called state. Now we have touched on state many times already, but now it's time to really learn what state is and then how we can use it in practice. So we learned how to use event handlers, but now we want them to actually do something useful, right? So we want to make the component interactive. And for that, as I have mentioned already, we need state. Now, without a doubt, state is the most important concept in React. So everything basically revolves around state in React. And so we will keep learning about state throughout the entire course. Therefore, let's start with an overview of what exactly you will learn about state while going through this course. First, we will learn what state actually is, what it does, and why we need it, which is what this section is all about. Then we need to learn how to actually use state in practice using the useState or useReducer hooks, the context API, or even external tools like Redux. We will also need to deeply understand how to think about state in React. And so these are topics for future sections. Okay, and with this out of the way, we're now ready to learn what state actually is. So we have learned how to pass data into a component by using props, which, remember, is data that's coming from outside the component. But what if a component needs to actually hold its own data and also hold it over time? Also, what if we actually want to make our app interactive, changing the UI as a result of an action? Well, that's where finally state comes into play. So state is basically data that a component can hold over time, and we use it for information that a component needs to remember throughout its life cycle. Therefore, we can think of state as being the memory of a component. So that can be quite a helpful analogy, I think. Now, examples of state can be simple things like a notification count, the text content of an input field, or the active tab in a tabbed component. It can also be a bit more complex data, for example, the content of a shopping cart. Now, what all these pieces of state have in common is that in the application, the user can easily change these values. For example, when they read a notification, the count will go down by 1, or when they click on another tab, that tab will become active. And therefore, each of these components needs to be able to hold this data over time, so over the life cycle of the application. And for that reason, each of these pieces of information is a piece of state. And notice how I used the term piece of state here, because just the term state itself is more of a general term. So a piece of state, or a state variable, is just one single actual variable in the component that we can define in our code. On the other hand, the term state itself is more about the entire state that the component is in, like the entire condition at a certain point in time. So basically, the general term state is all the pieces of state together. And if this sounds confusing, don't worry. These are just some minor differences in terminology. In practice, we usually use the terms state, piece of state, and state variable quite interchangeably. But anyway, let's now move on to the most important aspect of state, which is the fact that updating state triggers React to re-render the component. So, again, whenever we update a piece of state in a component, this will make React re-render that component in the user interface. So it will create a new updated view for that component. And a component's view is basically just the component visually rendered on the screen, so in the user interface. Now, up until this point, I have always just used the generic term user interface. But now we are actually talking about a single component. And when one single component is rendered, we call that a view. And so all the views combined together then make up the final user interface. Now, do you remember this small diagram that we saw right at the beginning of the course when we first talked about how React automatically keeps data in sync with the UI? Well, state is how React does that. So state is how React keeps the user interface in sync with data. We change the state, we change the UI. So, summarizing, state allows developers to do two important things. First, state allows us to update the component's view by re-rendering the component. So it gives us a way to change part of the UI. Second, state allows developers to persist local variables between multiple renders and re-renders. So if you think about this, state is basically a tool. And in fact, it's the most powerful tool that we have in the world of React. So understanding how state works and what it does, so understanding the mechanics of state, will unlock the power of React development for you. But before we go understand the mechanics of state, let's actually first go back to our code and use this powerful tool in practice for the first time. So now that we know what state is, let's try to implement it in our small project. And just as a quick reminder, what we want to happen is that when we click this next and this previous button, we basically want the step to change. So the step here is currently set to 1, but we want this step variable basically to be dynamic. And so for that, we now need to add a new piece of state to our component. So let's get rid of this and add that new piece of state. So In order to use state in practice in a component, we do it in 3 steps. First, we add a new state variable, then we use it in the code, and usually in JSX, and third, we then update the piece of state in some event handler. And so let's start with the first step, which is to actually create the state variable. And we do so using the useState function that React provides to us. So that's useState. And if now I hit enter on my keyboard, as this useState here is selected in the VS Code autocomplete, VS Code will automatically import the useState function from React. So this line of code right here. Now, if for some reason that didn't happen in your code editor, then make sure that you import the useState function from React in that way. So the useState function is a function, and so it takes an argument. And the argument that we need to specify here is the default value of this state variable. So that's, in our case, step number 1, right? Now this useState function here will return an array. And so actually, let's just call that array for now and then log it to the console. So just so you see. And so, yeah, now step is no longer defined. Let's just put that back for a minute. Step equals 1. And then open up our console here. So this is the array. And so you see it has 2 values here. So this first value, so this number 1, is the default value that we want for our state. So this one here. And then the second one is a function that we can use to update our state variable. So what we usually do is to then immediately destructure this array right here. So first we have step, which again is this first right here. And so this will be our state variable itself. And then second, again, we have the function. And so this one we usually call set, and then the name of the state variable. So set step in this case. Now we can get rid of this. And if we now reload, we see that our app is already using that piece of state, so that step variable, because this is exactly the variable name that we had before. So we are already using the step in our JSX here, and also here for this class name. Okay, so we have completed the first step of defining the state variable using the useState function, and the second step in which we use the state variable, so this step piece of state in our code. And so now the third step is to actually update the state in an event handler. So let's get rid of this alert, which was just a placeholder. Or actually, let's start with this one. So with the next one. So now it's time to use this set step function here. So we use set step to update the step state variable. And so what do we want the step to be? Well, basically just the current step plus 1. Right? So when we click the next button, the step should go 1 up. And so that's the current step plus 1. And so now we are ready to test this. So let's see. And yeah, that works. So our component is now dynamic. And so congratulations, you just unlocked the power of state and the power of React. So what happened here as we clicked on this button was that the handle next event handler function was called, and this event handler then updated the step state. And so then React automatically rendered this new component view for us. So that's just amazing. Now let's go back here and implement also the handle previous function. And here we basically want the opposite. So set step and then step minus 1. So let's see. And yeah, that works. However, right now we have a small bug in our app, because watch what happens when I keep clicking here. So you see step 0 and step minus 1 and so on. And the same here. So if I keep going, then of course we have no more elements in our array to show. So the array only has 3 elements, and so step 5 or anything below step 0 doesn't make any sense. And so here in the handler function, we can simply add a condition in order to prevent that. So let's just say if the step is greater than 1, only then set this step. And then here, something similar. So if the step is less than 3. So let's see, let's reload this. And so now if I click next, so right now the step is 3. So this one here is no longer true. And so now then this part should not be executed. And indeed, that works. So we fixed that small bug, and now our component is working just as we wanted. Great. Now just a few more things about the creation of the state variable here. So first of all, this useState function here is what we call a hook in React. And we can identify hooks because they start with this use keyword here. So all the React functions that start with use like this, for example, useEffect or useReducer, and of course this useState, are React hooks. And we will learn in detail what a React hook is a bit later, but for now what you need to know is that we can only call hooks like useState on the top level of the function. So of this component function right here. So only here is it allowed to call useState, not inside an if statement or inside another function or inside a loop. So for example, we could not do this. So immediately React would then tell us that the useState hook was called in a function that is not a React function component. So we can only do that right here. So also not in an if statement. So let's say if true, for example, then let's see. And again, you see immediately that we get this error saying that the useState was called conditionally. And before it actually gets to this dramatic error here, we can even see in this overlay in VS Code that React hook was called conditionally. And this one here is coming from ESLint, by the way. And that's why it was so important to set up ESLint in the beginning. Okay, but anyway, let's remove all of this. And now the other important thing about state is that we should really only update state using this setter function right here, so not manually. Now just to finish, I just noticed that here we actually don't need this when we use our step here. So there's no need for a template literal here, because here we are not really creating a new string. We are just basically outputting a new string based here on this ternary operator. But anyway, we now have this nice dynamic component, all without the imperative DOM manipulations that we need in vanilla JavaScript. By the end of the last lecture, I said that we should only update state using the setter function. But don't just trust me on that. So instead, let's actually explore this and break React. So just to see what happens when we try to update state manually. Now, right now we have this step state here defined as a const variable. And so we would not be able to even change it. So let's change this to a let. And so then we can actually break this. So let's say that here in handle next, instead of updating the state in the correct way, we would do it like this. So step equal step plus 1. That would be a perfectly normal way of updating a variable defined with let, right? And so right now, this is a let variable, so a variable that we can update. And so again, this would be a perfectly normal way of updating variables in JavaScript. But let's see what now happens when we click this button. Well, simply nothing happens. So we don't get any error from React, but simply nothing happens. And so the reason for that is that React has no way of knowing that this is actually trying to update the state. So React has no magic way of knowing that this here is the state variable and that this operation is basically updating it. So again, React doesn't know about that. And that's why React provided us with this setter function here, which is a functional way of updating the state value, but without mutating it. Because here we are directly mutating now this step variable, right? But React is all about immutability. And so therefore, we can only update the state using the tools that React gives us. So in this case, this set step function. And so this setter function is actually tied to this state variable right here. So when we use this functional way of updating the state, then React does know that this is the state variable that should be updated. Okay, so never do this mistake. Just always use const and always use the setter function. Okay. Now another way in which this could happen, which might be a little bit less obvious, is when we use an object or an array for state. So let's just do a quick experiment here. So let's just say test, for example, and then use state. And here as a default, we pass in an object. And let's give it some property of name. Now notice that here in the destructuring, I only took out the state variable itself. So I don't even have the setter function now. And so here, let's say that I wanted to update this name. Well, let's first actually also print it here. So test.name. So then we get Jonas there. And then here we might think that this is how we update that state. So test.name. And now let's use Fred, for example. So just some other name. And yeah, watch what happens when I click next now. And that did actually work. So mutating the object like this did actually trigger a new re-render of the component view. However, mutating objects like this is a really, really bad practice. So React really doesn't want you to do this. And that's because sometimes in more complex situations, this actually won't work. And in general, it's really just a bad practice of mutating objects like this, especially in a framework like React, which is all about immutability and functional state updates. So never do this. So if you really wanted to update this object here, we would again create a setter function here. So not creating, but basically taking this setter function out of the result of useState. And then here we would call that setter function and then pass in the complete new object. So the name should now be Fred. So it's back to what we had before now. And now if we click next, that still updates the name to Fred, but it does so in the correct way. So always treat state as immutable in React. So as something that you cannot change directly, but that you can only change using the tools that React gives us. So using the state setter function. Okay, so we have just seen the power of state by using the useState function. But now let's get a better understanding of how exactly state works in React. And let's start from a fundamental React principle that we have already discussed earlier. So remember how we learned that in React, we do not manipulate the DOM directly when we want to update a component's view, right? So React is declarative, not imperative. And so we never touch the DOM in our code. But if that's the case, then this leads us to the question of how do we update the component on the screen whenever some data changes or whenever we need to respond to some event like a click. Now we already know that the answer to this question is state, but here we are trying to derive it from first principles. So anyway, to answer that question, we need to understand another fundamental React principle, which is the fact that React updates a component view by re-rendering that entire component whenever the underlying data changes. Now, as soon as we will reach the section about how React works behind the scenes, we will learn exactly what actually happens inside React when a component re-renders. But for now, just know that re-rendering basically means that React calls the component function again, so each time the component is rendered. So conceptually, we can imagine this as React removing the entire view and replacing it with a new one each time a re-render needs to happen. But again, we will learn exactly what happens later. Now, React preserves the component state throughout re-renders. And so even though a component can be rendered and re-rendered time and time again, the state will not be reset unless the component disappears from the UI entirely, which is what we call unmounting. Now, speaking of state, it is when state is updated that a component is automatically re-rendered. So let's imagine that there is an event handler in the view, for example, on a button that the user can click. So the moment that button is clicked, we can update a piece of state in our component using the set function coming from the useState hook. So just like we did in the last lecture, right? Then when React sees that the state has been changed, it will automatically re-render the component, which will result in an updated view for this component. Or as a more real example, we can look at the simple advice app that we built right in the first lecture of the course. So in that application, each time we click the Get Advice button, a new piece of advice is fetched from the API. Then, when that data arrives, we store the data in the advice state variable. So we update the advice state. So let's imagine that the new advice is quality beats quantity. React will notice this state change and re-render the component. So it will remove the old one and display a new updated component view on the screen. And with this, I hope that the mechanics of state in React are now really clear to you. So the conclusion of all this is that as React developers, whenever we want to update a component view, we update its state. And so React will then react to that update and do its thing. And in fact, this whole mechanism is so fundamental to React that it's actually the reason why React is called React in the first place. So on a high level, moving from the component level to the application level now, React reacts to state changes by re-rendering the user interface. That's the main thing that it does, and therefore it was decided to call this library React. And with this, we have come full circle from the first lecture about why frameworks exist. There we learned that frameworks exist to keep UI in sync with data. And so now we have learned a bit better how React does that. So to practice state a little bit more, let's now implement the open and close functionality for our component. So looking at the demo here, what we want to implement now is this functionality that when we click this button here, then this part of the component disappears, and then when we click it again, then it is back. So since this is something that changes on the screen, that means that we need a new piece of state. Let's first comment out this other state that we have here so that we created for our experiment. I will not completely delete it, just to keep it as a reference here. But anyway, let's now create a new piece of state. So this is going to be called isOpen. And then again, the convention for the setter is to call it set and then the name of the state. So set is open. So equal use state, and by default, our component should be open. Therefore, we pass in value of true. So isOpen starts as true, and so that's then our default state value for the isOpen state. So that's the first part of using state. the second one is to then actually use this state variable in our code. So what do we want to achieve with this state variable? Well, whenever it is true, we want this here to show, and if it's false, we don't want this to show. And whenever it's false, we don't want this to show. So what this means is that we need conditional rendering. So let's do that. Now we cannot wrap all of this here into JavaScript mode now, but let's still try. So I selected all of it, and then I will open the curly braces to enter JavaScript mode, but this will not really work because this can only be done inside some element. So for example, we would need a div here. And so then here, close it. However, React is still not happy. So what do we have here? Test is not defined. So that's because we just removed this piece of state here from before. So let's just comment this out and give it a save. And again, we first needed to create this div element here outside, basically to start our JSX. And so then inside that JSX is where we can enter the JavaScript mode. And we need this JavaScript mode here because now we will use our isOpen. And then as for the conditional rendering, let's simply use the end operator. Give it a save, and that's already it. So whenever this is true, then the second part here will be returned, and when it's false, then only false will be returned. So that's just what we learned in the previous section. All right, now since this is true, nothing happens here, so this is still visible, but if we were to set it to false, then our component should disappear. Yeah, so it's gone, and therefore what this means is that this is working. So let's set it back to true, and with this we finish the second part of using state. And now the third part of using state is to actually update the state. So for that we need our button here in the corner, and for that we need to write some more JSX. So let's do that here. So button with a class name of close, and then here we can use an HTML entity of times, which will basically write an X. There we go. And now we need our event handler. So for that, let's again use the onClick prop. So to directly attach the event handler onto this element. And this time, just to show you, let me actually create a function inline here. So instead of creating a handle function out here, like these two, I will now define the function directly here. So just to show you that sometimes this is also what we do, especially when we have some very simple logic. So we need to create a new function. And now what do we want to do here? Well, we want to update the isOpen state. So set isOpen, and then again, we need to pass in the new state. So the updated state. And what should that be? Well, it should always be the opposite of the current state. So if isOpen is true, it should become false, and if it's false, it should become true. And the way we do that is by using the not operator. So again, that's just common and standard JavaScript. Okay, and this should now already work. So let's just reload here to get rid of that error. And yes, beautiful. That's working nice. So our view is updated, so it's re-rendered. And so then after that re-render, isOpen is no longer true, but it's false. Therefore, then this entire part here of JSX is no longer rendered. Right? But then when we click again, this function here is called again, which will then switch isOpen to the other state. So from false to true in this case. And so updating this piece of state will then cause React to re-render the component, this time with isOpen to true. So when React then sees this piece of code, isOpen is true, and therefore this JSX is then returned. And so with this, we update the view right here in our application. Great. Now, what I want you to notice about this is that let's change the state here. So again, with this here, we change the step state, which right now is at number 2. And now if we toggle this state, so if we change the state and change it again, you see that React did indeed remember the state of the step, even though we did re-render this component multiple times in between, right? So if we set it to 3, and then again, I can open and I can close, which means that this component, so this view here, has been re-rendered 2 times, still it will remember this other piece of state. So the 3 is still here. And so that's why we say that state is like a memory of the component. It can hold this information over time, even though we render and re-render it over and over again. Great. So with this, I hope you start seeing how we can use state in different situations and for different things in practice. Now, just one small thing that we could change here, and this has nothing to do with state, is that we actually don't want to return just one element here. So we want to return basically both this part here and the button. And so this means that this is a great use case for a React fragment here. So before I do that, let's just inspect. And so indeed, we have our root, which is basically everything, so the entire app. And then in there, we have this div, which is this one. But again, let's say we don't want that. Let's say we just want to have the button and then this steps div. So let's remove this from here and from here. And so now we have, remember, a fragment. So that's like the root of this JSX element here, which will then disappear in the DOM. So if we take a look now, then we only have this button and the steps div. So again, whenever you're in a situation like this, so where you need a piece of JSX to return 2 elements, then the fragment is great for that. As web developers, we rely a lot on developer tools. So things like the console or the element inspect panel in our browser. And so since tools are so helpful for developers, the React team built DevTools specific for React, which can be extremely helpful when working with state. And so since we're working with state now, let's go check them out. And actually, since the beginning, we got this message here in our console telling us to download these DevTools. So you can open up your console, and then here you will find the link to the place in the React documentation where we then can find the link to the DevTools. So here is the link for the Chrome Web Store and then for the other browsers. But since we're using Google Chrome, this is the one that we want. And if for some reason this link here didn't appear in your console, you can just Google Chrome React DevTools. So yeah, that's going to be this first one. And so then once you're on this page, or on this one, which is the same, you can just download this extension and install it in your Google Chrome. Now, I cannot do this because I'm on a guest window, so let me quickly fix that. And so now here in this window, I can actually use these DevTools as well. So hopefully you installed the tool, so just like any other Chrome extension. And then once you did, down here, once you have these developer tools here already open, you will see one tab which appears here, or actually 2, which are coming from the React DevTools. So that's this component tab and this profiler tab. And since we're going to use this all the time, we can even drag, well, actually not. Now we can like drag it here to the beginning where it will then stay. Now here it says loading React element tree, which should be fast. So let's try that again. And actually it only worked for me after closing and reopening my browser. So if you see the same error message that I had previously down here, then please go ahead and do the same now. But so now everything is working. And so let's take a look at these DevTools, and in particular of this component part of the DevTools. Because again, there's another part, which is this profiler, but we will come back to that a bit later. So components, basically, as the name says, is for showing a component tree. Now, right now we only have one component, so only the app component, and so then this is the only one that we can see here. But if we had more, then all of them would be showing up down here, and we could see our entire component tree. So I will show you this again once we have that. The point here now is that we can take a look at all the state that is inside each component. Let's make this even a bit bigger here so you can actually see. Well, that's maybe too big. Or I can also make the entire window bigger. So just like this. So you see here that first we have this props, which is for all the props that the component that is currently selected is receiving. And in this case, we of course are receiving no props, so nothing there. But then here is the interesting part. So here we then have a list of all the hooks. And so here we have these two entries, one for each state hook that we used. So remember that we created the state with use state, and these use functions are hooks. Therefore, they are here in the list of hooks. But anyway, what's interesting is that we can now manipulate these values down here to experiment with them. For example, when we have a Boolean value, we here get this checkbox, and so then we can toggle it, which will then also toggle the value here. So from true to false. So basically we can do the same thing as in the UI, but here with the DevTools. And so that's very useful, and it's a bit similar to what we also can do with CSS here in the Element tab. So here we can do similar things. So this was inspired by that. And then of course here we can also change this state. So we can go from 1 to 3 directly, or of course we can also try with values that we usually cannot access from the UI. So by clicking these buttons, we cannot set the state to 10, for example. But maybe for some reason we need to see what the UI looks like with 10. And so then we can come here to the DevTools and set it to this. Now, again, this is just a small demo example, so here that wouldn't be important, but in bigger and large-scale applications, this might be necessary from time to time. And so this is very, very important to keep in mind that you can use the DevTools for this kind of thing. So that's one thing, and as I mentioned earlier, it's also very useful to be able to see the entire component tree right here. Because when we have many, many files in a project and dozens or even hundreds of components in our app maybe, then it can become quickly out of hand and we can lose sight which components are where. And so then a component tree can become very handy. So instead of drawing that manually, we just come here and there it is. Okay, and that's for now all I had to tell you about these DevTools. Very handy, make sure that you install them, and we will come back to them in future lectures for sure. It's very common that we update a state variable based on the current value of that state. And so let's now learn how to best do that. And in fact, we are updating state based on the current state all the time here. So here, for example, in setStep, we take the current step and then subtract 1. And here the same. So here we take the current is open state and toggle it basically. And so this is what I mean with updating state based on the current state. Now, the way we are doing it right now is working just fine, right? So our app works fine, but now let's imagine that after a few months, we come back to this app and then we want to change something. So let's say that we want this handle next function here to actually move forward twice. So let's say that we want to set the step state twice. So there's nothing stopping us from doing that. So we can do this once and duplicate it. So this is perfectly fine. We can call the same function twice. But what happens now? So what do you think is going to happen when I click next now? So in theory, it should take the step, which is currently 1, add 1, so 2, and then here it should do the same from 2 to 3, right? But again, watch what happens. So it only updated the state once. Now we will go into detail why exactly this happens, but for now what I need you to know is that we should not update state based on the current state like this. So the way that we have been doing it. Instead, what we should do is to pass in a callback function here. So instead of a value, we pass a function which will receive as the argument the current value of the state. So let's remove this here and let's create a function. And I will just create a simple arrow function here. And so as I was saying, this will receive as an input the current value of the state. Now there are multiple conventions on how to call this argument. So we could again call it step, but this might then be a bit confusing. We can call it the current step, for example, or just s. And so this is what I'm going to do now. So just an abbreviation. And so then here we can do s minus 1 just like before. And so this will now work the exact same way, right? So the view here was updated in the same way as before, but this is a little bit more correct. Because if we do this here, so again, receiving the current step as an input, which we just call s, but it could be called anything, right? And so then here we return that current step plus 1. And the same here. Plus 1. And so if we run this again, then it works. So then it is updating the state twice. So it started at 1, then therefore this callback here received the value of 1, and then 1 plus 1 was 2. And then here in the next state up, that updated value is already passed here into this callback. And so then we have 2 plus 1, which makes 3. Now here we actually do not want this, of course. So we just want to move forward by 1. But in order to be safe for future updates, it's a good idea to always use a callback like this when we want to update state based on the current value of that state. So let's do the same here. So again, here we are also doing the same. So we are also setting the isOpen state based on the current one. So let's just call it is and then toggle that. All right. And that works beautifully. Now, when we're not setting state based on the current state, then of course we can just pass in the value as normal. So just like we did here, for example. So that also happens sometimes. And so in that case, we need no callback. Then we just pass in the new state value as we do here and as we also had here previously. So again, in many situations, that would work just fine. So before we only had the s minus 1 here and nothing else, and so that worked as well. But in order to be safe for future updates or for working with coworkers, it's best to update the state in a more safe way like this. And so from now on, I will do this each time that we update the state based on the current value of the state. As we finish this first dive into state, I want to share a few more important thoughts or ideas about state, as well as some practical guidelines. So, first of all, there is one important technical detail that you should be aware of. And this might seem obvious, but it's still worth mentioning. So, what I'm talking about is the fact that each component really has and manages its own state. So even if we render the same component multiple times on one page, each of these component instances will operate independently from all the other ones. So in this example, the 3 counter components all start with a piece of state called score, which is set initially to 0. Then, if one of the buttons is clicked, that increases the score by 1 for each click, but only in that component. The state in all the other components stays the same. So again, if we change the state in one of the components, that won't affect the other components at all. And so the same thing, of course, is going to happen when we click one of the other buttons, or even when one of the components is removed from the UI entirely. So state really is isolated inside of each component. Now, if we analyze everything that we just learned about state, we can come to the conclusion that we can basically think of the entire application view, so the entire user interface, as a function of state. Or in other words, the entire UI is always a representation of all the current states in all components. And taking this idea even one step further, a React application is fundamentally all about changing state over time, and of course also correctly displaying that state at all times. And this is really what the declarative approach to building user interfaces is all about. So instead of viewing a UI as explicit DOM manipulations, with state, we now view a UI as a reflection of data changing over time. And as you know by now, we describe that reflection of data using state, event handlers, and JSX. So we describe the UI, React does the rest. Now, this might all sound a bit philosophical at this point in your journey, but trust me, as you become more and more experienced in building React apps and working with state, you will truly and deeply understand everything I just said here. Okay, and now to finish, let me give you a few guidelines on how to use state in practice. So practical guidelines is always what students like the most, and here this also kind of serves as a summary of state in general. And these guidelines are for you to keep as a reference. So there is a lot of text here that I will just quickly go over now. So first of all, you should create a new state variable for any data that a component should keep track of over time. And the easy way of figuring this out is to think of variables that need to change at some point in the future. So if you're used to building apps in vanilla JavaScript, those would be variables defined with let or with var, or also an array or object that you mutate over the application's lifecycle. So in React, you use state for those. Another way of figuring out when you need state is this. Whenever you want something in a component to be dynamic, create a piece of state related to that thing, and then update the state when the thing should change. Or in other words, when you need it to be dynamic. Now, since this thing is a bit abstract, let's think of a modal window that can be either open or closed. So for a modal window, we can create a state variable called isOpen that will keep track of whether the modal is currently open or not. Then, when isOpen is true, we display the window on the screen, and if it's false, we hide it. Simple, right? So whenever you want to change the way a component looks like or the data that it displays, just update its state, which you usually do inside an event handler function. Now, when you're actually building your components, it's going to be useful to always imagine the component's view, so the component rendered on the screen, as a reflection of state changing and evolving over time. Finally, there is one common mistake that many beginners make, which is to use state for every single variable that you need in a component. But that's really not necessary. So do not use state for variables that should not trigger a re-render, okay? Because that will just cause unnecessary re-renders, which can cause performance issues. So it's very common to need some variables that are not state. And so for those, you can just use regular variables defined with const. But we will come back to this in the next section. Alright, so this is my first set of guidelines about state, which should be more than enough for now. So if you truly internalize these, then building React applications in the future should be a lot easier for you. And I say this because I really believe that mastering state is the most difficult part of learning React. But once you overcome this hurdle and truly internalize when you need state and how it all works, it will unlock React development for you. And so that's why I spent so much time here showing you how state works. So to finish up this part, I want to once again do a quick comparison of the React code that we just wrote with an equivalent vanilla JavaScript implementation of the same app. And this vanilla JavaScript implementation I actually gave you at the beginning of this section. So we placed it right in the public folder. So let's now open that up and open it here on the side. Okay. So again, the vanilla JavaScript implementation is inside an HTML file, where here we have first the HTML and then separated the JavaScript. So this HTML might look familiar, as it is quite similar, of course, to this JSX. The only thing we don't have here is the button to open and close the component. So I didn't include that part. But anyway, here then starts our script. So we have the same messages. And then here we have to manually select all of these DOM elements based on the classes that we gave them. Then next we have this let variable here with a step, which we will then update down here in these event handler functions. So here we took the elements that we selected manually and used add event listener on them. We have a similar logic inside of these event handlers to basically update the step variable. So when we go back, the step goes -1, and when we go forward, the step goes +1. So this is a bit similar to what we have here, so these event handlers. But the big difference is that here, all we have to do is to just update the state. And so then React will keep the UI in sync, where here we first update the state variable, and then we have to call this function, which does the DOM manipulation. So here, inside of the update UI values function, we need to now manually update the DOM and keep it in sync with the step state. Because of course, as soon as we click these buttons here, if all we did was to update this value, then nothing would happen in the UI. So after doing that, we need to then call this function here, or of course we could also just have all of this code here, but since we need the same code here, I just place it into this function. So then here, we manually update the text content of the message, while here in the JSX, it is simply declared right in the markup. So here we have imperative code that tells JavaScript step by step what it needs to do. So update the text content, then set the class list, set this class list, and set this class list. So set the class to active in case that the step is currently active. While here, that's all just declared in the JSX. We don't tell React to do anything. We just write that here the step should be equal to the current step, and that here the active class should be inside the class name if the step is greater or equal 1. But we don't need the imperative DOM manipulation that we have here. So we talked about this now many times, and so I think that this is enough said at this point. But of course, it would be a good idea for you to keep comparing now these two implementations. There's just one small thing that I want to do here, which is going back to the previous lecture where I told you that each component has and manages its own state. So what I want to do now is to prove that to you in code. So let's actually take all of this code and place it into a new component, which we will call step. Or actually, let's call this component here step. Then we don't have to do so much copy pasting. Then let's remove this and actually call it steps. All right, and now here we do our app again. So export default function app, and then this app will basically include 2 steps. So let's say here we have a div And then we want to have the steps 2 times. Now just a few more changes we need to do. So now, since we have 2 components on the same page, let's actually return a div here so that the button and then these steps are all in the same place. And then just one quick change in the CSS, please. So down here in the close, let's just remove this line of code. All right, let's close that, put it here on the side. And then as you reload, you will see that now we have 2 steps on the page. So we successfully reused our steps component. So this is now no longer the app. Again, it is steps. And we can nicely see that here in the React DevTools. So now we have a bit of a bigger component tree. So we have app, and then it has 2 child components. So, but what I wanted to show you is that as we change the state in this one, for example, the state here will stay the same. And so even though both of them are steps component, the state in each of them is completely isolated. So of course, I can also close this one, and this one stays open. And we can obviously also see that down here in the DevTools with a bit more space even. Yeah, so the first steps here, the state is 3 and it is visible. So that's this true here. While the second one, the state is 1 and it is not visible. Okay, so that was just a small and quick demonstration. And so now that we have used state a couple of times here, it's time for you to practice state on your own in the upcoming coding challenge. Welcome to the next coding challenge, which, as you can imagine, is all about state. So what I want you to build in this challenge is this very simple date counter. So here we have the current date, but then when we click here on the plus icon, you see that the count increases to 1, and then it says 1 day from now, it is Tuesday, June 22, while before it was 21. And so then when we keep going up, it basically keeps adding this number of days to the current date. We can also go back in time. So like 6 days ago, it was this date. So that's the most basic thing. But then here we can also adjust the step. So for example, if the step is 5, then each time we click on the plus button, it increases by 5. So no longer by 1. So 10, 15, 20, and so on and so forth. And the calculation then here, of course, is still the same. So that's what we're going to build. So open up a new code sandbox with react.new, or of course, as always, you can also build this challenge on your local computer. So for that, you can just create a new React app, just like we have been doing before. Now here, just to make sure you can see, I will make this a bit bigger, maybe not that big. And then I will actually just start writing a little bit of code here. So just to show you what I actually want. So I want you to create this counter function, which for now will just return tests. And then all we want to do is to include that counter right here. And that's it. So you can leave everything else the same, even the styles. Let's just leave them here and just focus on this counter functionality. Now this part here with the dates can be a little bit tricky. So what I want you to focus on the most is actually the counter functionality here. So if the dates are a bit too tricky, then just leave that until the end and you can just print the current count value down here. Or you can also just Google, for example, JavaScript add days to date. Okay, so I will leave this up here so you can see what you are supposed to build. And then I meet you back here in a minute with my solution. All right, so welcome back. Hopefully you had some success with this. So there's actually a lot of moving parts here with handling the events and all the state. So hopefully the lectures that we had previously were enough for you to understand how this works. But if not, there's really no problem with that at all. So hopefully you just did anything, even if just the very simple counter. That's also fine. But anyway, we know that we want this count value here to update in the UI. So the view of this component should update whenever we click on one of these buttons. So that's a good sign that we need some state, right? So let's start by creating the count state. So const count and set count is useState. And now for some reason the useState didn't automatically get import. So we need to do that by hand from React. Nice. And now, well, we need to show this count on the screen and then we need to update it. So as always, the same 3 steps. So first, declaring the state variable, then use it in the JSX and then update it. So here we are missing the default of 0. And then let's just create one div with these 2 buttons and also with the value of the counter itself. So starting with that value actually, let's just count and then the count value. Oh, what's that? So count is 0, that's correct. And now we need some buttons. So button and on click. And here I will actually not create the event handler function separately, but instead I will just define them inline here. But if you did it separately, that's of course no problem at all. So what do we want to do here? So this one here is to decreasing the value. So set count, and we want the new count to be the current count minus 1. So what that means is that we want to update the count state based on the current state. And therefore, here we now should pass in a callback function. Remember that? So I'm going to write C for count. So this stands for count. And remember, it is the current value of the count state. And so then we want to return that count minus 1. And that should already be it. Let's just use this here for the minus sign. All right. Then let's copy paste. Well, let's actually just close down this sidebar. So copy and paste, and here just +1. So give it a save. And well, let's just adjust here the output a bit. And beautiful. That's working already. So the component view is being updated as we update the state. Great. And so now let's just also display the date down there. So for that, let's create a paragraph, or first, let's actually calculate that date. So maybe you Googled how to do this as I advised you to. So let's just define a variable called date and then new date. And of course, you can just leave it like this, or you can just pass in a string, for example, to define any other date that you want. For example, June 21st, 2027, so just for fun. So that's not a date today, as you can imagine. But anyway, now here we can, on the date object, call the setDate method. And so then here we can do date plus get the current date. Whoa, what's that? Yeah, date dot. So getting the current date and then adding a value. So that value can be the count. All right. So we're using now our count to add that count to the current date, basically. And so then that's what we can output down here. But again, this part was kind of optional here, really. So this is not what I was concerned about. What matters is that you got the state part right. So, but anyway, here let's now log the date and then convert it to a nice readable string. So toDate string. All right, now here we got some problems, and that's because Yeah, right now our JSX has 2 root elements. That's because I, by mistake, placed this outside the div, but there we go. So you see, that's already working. Nice. Now we are missing that part here that says the 30 days from now, for example, or today, or 10 days ago. So let's do that. And so to do this, let's add maybe another span. Let's wrap this one into a span element. And then let's create a span. So just for some inline text. And now here, then let's create that part of the string. So if the count is 0, then it is today. So then here we can output the string today is. And if not, for now, let's return nothing. And here we have a problem. And that's because here we need a colon. All right. So count is not 0 right now, but now it is. So today is this date. So that's correct. But now as an alternative here, we need to also account for the past and for the future. So we actually need 2 more different values here. And so here we need another ternary operator. Now using nested ternaries is quite ugly and can be quite unreadable. So usually I advise against using that, but well, here let's just break that rule. So basically here we have the else branch. And so then here we can ask if the count is greater than 0, then the string should be, let's use a template literal, then the count days from today is, and else count days ago was. Not like this. All right. So Prettier took care of formatting it for us. So it's at least a little bit more readable. So that works. 5 is, here we're missing the space. And now for the past. So -4 days ago was. So let's quickly do a math.absolute here. And yeah, that fixes it. So we have now this main counter working. So basically this part here is working. And now let's worry about the step. And the step is going to be quite similar. So const step and set step. And here I need to learn how to write step, apparently. And then use state again. And here the step by default is 1. So because by default, when we click here, we just want the counter to go up by 1. All right. And now we can just like copy paste this because it's going to look very similar. But here then we have the step. Then here also the step. And here also set step in both these places. So let's see. And yes, that's working. However, of course, if we now click here, then that step is not being applied here. So we are still simply adding 1 or subtracting 1. So how do we now put these two together? Well, as I was just saying, by default, we are just subtracting or adding 1. But that's no longer what we want. Instead, we want to add or subtract the step. So just replace the 1 here, step, and yes, that's working. Nice. And we can even go negative here, I think. Maybe we should change that, but never mind. That's too much work. So now if we add 3, we are actually going into the past. But yeah, that's no problem. Great. So that wraps up this challenge. It works exactly as what we had set out to build. So hopefully you had some fun with this. Hopefully you also did have some success. And so, yeah, let's keep going in this section And actually, we will just, in the next lecture, create a brand new, very, very nice project. So I hope to see you there as soon as possible. In the second part of this section, let's now build our first project that has some real interactivity. And so, let's get straight to it. And by now, you know the drill. So if you're on Windows, open up your command prompt. If you're on a Mac, open your terminal, please. And then, as always, navigate to the folder where you want to create your project. So that's my desktop. And then in there, run npx create react app. And then please specify version number 5 here. And then finally, the name of the project, which is going to be travel list. Then hit enter and then let create react app do its thing. And in the meantime, I will give you a quick tour of the app that we're going to build. So this is the Faraway app, which is a simple travel list where we can add all the items that we need for our next trip. So for example, let's say we need 2 boarding passes that we really cannot forget. And then we can hit enter or click here. And so then that item gets added here to the list. And also you see that down here we have the statistics that just got updated. So that's already some interactivity right there, but of course we can do more. So for example, let's say we don't need the charger anymore for some reason. So we can just click there and it's gone. We also can mark these items as completed. So basically as packed. So let's say we already packed that one. And then down here it says we already packed 2, which is 50%. But there is even more. So we can also sort by these 3 things here. So input order, or by description, or by the packed status. And so then the packed items here, they appear at the end. And finally, maybe once we are back from our trip and want to prepare our next one, we can just clear the entire list at once. So it then asks us if we are sure, and yes we are. And indeed, then our list becomes completely empty. And that's it. So I think this is a really nice little project for us to learn some more interactivity, and it has all these nice but simple features that we are going to build. And on top of that, I also really like this nice design here. It's a bit retro, which I think really fits the vibe of this application. And now, before we start writing any code, let's actually take a look at how we can break up this entire design into components. So this first big yellow part, I think we can call this the logo of the application. And so we're going to create one component called logo just for this part. Then next up, we clearly have some form here. And so that's where we are going to put these elements. So yet another component. Next, then we have this entire list, which I think can be called the packing list. And then in there, each of these items is, well, just called an item. We could call it a packing item maybe, but we'll see once we get to the code. Finally, down here, we have this other area, which I think we can just call stats or statistics. So this is how we are going to break up this user interface into components. And we will talk a lot more about how we actually do this, so how we arrive at these different components, but that's not the focus of this application. Here we just want to work a little bit more with state, with events, and also learn about how we can handle form submissions. So if that sounds fun, then let's quickly move on to the next lecture and start implementing this layout. So, with our project now installed, let's start by building the static layout of the application. And as always, let's start by getting the starter files, which in this case is just this CSS file. So of course that we don't have to write any styles ourselves. Then place that here into source. Now there will already be one, so just replace that. And since we're already here, we can get rid of all the junk that we don't need. So all of these. So in the end, we just have app.js, index.css, and index.js. Okay, then just renaming this here once again, and then let's drag and drop it onto the VS Code icon. Okay. So here we already have our files. As always, we need to clean this one here because we are importing some files that we no longer have, basically. But that's it. And once again, if you feel like it, you can actually delete all of this and write the code yourself just to practice how we can set up this React app from complete scratch. But I will just leave this here because in the end, when you build your own applications, you will always just leave this here as well. You're not always going to write everything from scratch. But here, I actually want to delete everything and start from scratch. So export default function app. So this is usually always the same as well here. So you always have your app parent component, which will include all the other components. And let's actually start with these other components. So just the components that we talked about in the previous lecture. So that's function logo. And now I will just quickly duplicate this code here just to make this a little bit faster. So packing list. And then we also have our stats. So these are the 4 big components that we identified in the last lecture. Remember that? And so let's now write a little bit of JSX for each of them, starting with the logo. So the logo is many times an image, but in this case, we will just have a primary heading and we will say far away. And then let's add some emoji here. Now the way we write emojis on the Mac is by hitting Control, Command, Spacebar. And on Windows, the shortcut is Windows plus period. So like this. So the Windows key and then plus this dot. All right. Then here let's use a palm tree. So this one here. And then a bag. Just like this. And in case you can't get these emojis to work, you can always just copy them from the final files of this project, or you can, of course, just ignore them as well. So these are just to make the design a little bit nicer. Okay, that's enough for the logo. So we will just write some very simple starter JSX here for each component as we are scaffolding basically this layout. So here let's just return a div with the class of add form. And again, you can of course explore this CSS file and see all the CSS that I wrote for these class names that we are going to import here. So in here later we will have these form elements like the select box, the input box, and that button. But for now we will just write the text. So what do you need for your trip? And here we also had some emoji. Let's add that as well. And it's actually already down here. Okay. And notice how ESLint is complaining that we are not using these variables here. But of course, we will do that soon by including all of them here in the global parent component. So here in this app. But again, let's leave that for later. So we do that in the end. For now, we just write the static part of all the components. And this one is the list. So again, just like a placeholder there. And let's make this one here a footer element. So remember how this stats is really at the bottom of the page. And so a footer seems like a good fit here. So let's write you have, and then here in the end we will have a number. So let's just use an X for now. Items on your list, and you already packed, and then again an X, which is X% of the total. Then here we also had some emoji, like this other bag here. And yeah, I think this one was also formatted. So let's use emphasize here. So EM. And now with that, let's come here to our app component and use all of them here in our layout. And if you want, you can actually pause the video here and do that as a challenge. So just create one div element with the class of app and then include the 4 components in there if you'd like. So this is how you do that. So with the class of app, and then one by one, one after the other, we just include them here. So first the logo, then the form. So actually exactly in the way that we define them in our code. And by the way, in more real apps, and also a bit later in the course, we will start placing each of these components here into one individual file. So we will then have one file called app.js for this component, one called logo.js for this one, and so on and so forth. But here, since we are still learning, I think it's easier to build all of them here in the same file, because otherwise we are jumping around all the times through these files. And so that then makes everything a lot more confusing, especially when we get into topics such as child-to-parent communication. But yeah, more about that very soon. So to finish the stats, and that's it. So no component is yellow here anymore, and so that means that we didn't forget any. And yeah, with this we are done. So let's open up our integrated terminal like this, and we are already in the correct folder. So npm start. And let's wait for it. Beautiful. Well, here it seems we missed some class. Let's make this smaller again. All right. And so this footer here needs the class of stats. Yeah, wonderful. So this is what it's supposed to look like, and it looks exactly like our demo. Well, except, of course, for these details right here, which we will take care of starting in the next lecture. So next up, we will start rendering some static items here. So we will not yet dynamically add new items to the list, but we will render some static items from an array here in the UI. Remember how I said earlier how rendering lists is one of the most common tasks in React development? Well, this application is no exception. And so let's now render the list of packing items. And first of all, let's go to our CSS file, because that's again where I pasted this array of initial items. So let's grab that. We can also close index.js, and I will paste it here at the very top. So you see that we have, once again, an array with a few objects. And in this case, each object describes one item to be packed. So each of them has an ID, a description, quantity, and here the packed property, which tells us whether this one has been packed or not. So based on this, we will then display the item a little bit differently. So here, well, here we don't have any. So here in the demo app. So you see right now it's not packed, but if it is packed, then you see it is like strike through. Okay, so let's now take these items here and render them as a list into our UI. So as the name says, we're going to do that in the packing list. So first of all, let's again use semantic HTML and convert this div into a UL. So into a unordered list. All right, and then immediately here, we enter JavaScript mode. Because remember how we render lists in React? Well, we simply use the map method that we already know on the array. So initial items, and later on we will of course then, when we make this dynamic, use another array here. But again, for now, here we just want to render something. So just to make this work. Okay, then inside the map method, each of the elements will be, let's say, an item. All right, and then for each item, what we want to render is an item component. So let's immediately write that here, and we will then create the item component in a minute. So item, and then we pass in as a prop the entire item. So item, and then item again. Let's close this here. So you see we have a lot of items here. So the name of the component, the name of the prop, and then here the object itself, which remember is the argument of this callback function in each iteration over this array. So nothing new here at this point, I hope. So I'll give this a save, but of course item is not defined. So let's quickly take care of that. And now here we need to accept the props, right? So we can do it like this, remember, but even better, we can immediately destructure this and then give it the name here of the prop that we passed in, which is item. And again, it could be anything. It could be object, like obj or x or anything. But yeah, it's easier to just call it item here because that's what it is. It's just a packing item, so to say. So here, this item should be now an li element, so a list item, because that's usually what direct children of the UI or of the UL element should be. And then just to start, just to see if it's working, let's simply render, I think it's called description. Yes, that's it. We'll just copy that actually. So item.description, give it a save, and there it is. So we have passports and socks. Now the styling here is a little bit off. And the reason for that is that here I actually did a mistake in the HTML. So here, let's actually create a div. And then it's this div that is supposed to have the list class. All right. And the reason for that is that later on, we will have another element in here for these filters. So we will have a div for these two things down here. All right. So of course, for me, that's easy to see now because I already built the app beforehand. But once you start building your apps on your own, there will be a lot more back and forth, which of course I cannot do here in this course because then it would take just forever. Okay. But anyway, let's now add some more here. So we don't just want the description. We also want this icon here for deleting. And later we will want this checkbox, but let's leave that for later actually. So here let's create a span element. So for the text, let's grab that, paste that here. And then we also want the item dot, let's see, it's the item dot quantity, exactly. So item dot quantity, and notice how sometimes Prettier creates like these empty strings here in our JSX. So many times this is not necessary, so just get rid of that. And now finally, we need that delete button. And for now, we won't attach any event handler here, but we will just place an icon here in the form of an emoji. So maybe like that. So this X right here. And again, if you can't make this work, then you can just write the X like this, or also like this. So that would work as well. All right. So this has now been rendered here based off this list. And if we duplicate this and add something else here, like a charger, one charger, then there it is. Now to finish, let's just mark one of them as packed. So make this one true so that we can add some additional styling here. So we want to basically have some strike through there. So that's simple stuff. So let's come here to the item. And here we will now conditionally add some styling. So instead of conditionally adding a class, here I want to conditionally simply add some style. So let's write style, and then it immediately enters JavaScript mode. But now I will not immediately write the object of CSS properties. Instead, let's actually use the ternary operator to decide which object the style should actually receive. So if item is packed, and here we don't really need a condition because this is already a Boolean. So if it is packed, then we want an object which will contain some CSS for the strike through. But if not, so if the item is not packed, then we will want to return this empty object. And so then no styles are going to be applied. So the CSS property that we're looking for is called text decoration. And let's set it to line through like this. And that worked quite nice. All right. So let's try another one just for fun. And yeah, immediately you see that it gets strike through as well. So this was yet another way of using the ternary operator to conditionally set some style here. So you see that we have a lot of freedom in React. And again, we simply use the JavaScript tools that we already have for this kind of stuff. One of the most important things that we do on the web is to interact with web applications through forms. So forms are fundamental in web applications. And so let's now start learning how to work with forms in React. And first off, when we build forms in React, we use the normal HTML form element. So we have a form, and then here let's add the select, the input, and the button. So just looking at the demo here, in HTML, this is a select element, this is an input element, and this is just a regular button. Here we need to change that as well. And there is a setting in VS Code that will make it so that as I update this one, the closing tag also gets updated, but I will find that out after this video and then I will let you know. But anyway, let's now create that select element. And now here we want to create a bunch of numbers. So inside the select, we create one option with the value. And here let's use again JavaScript mode. So in order to pass in an actual number 1 and not a string of 1, let's just duplicate this a few times because we will actually not use this. So you don't need to write this code if you don't want to. So this is just to show you what we will do instead in a minute here. Let's just create that input first of the type text. And let's also include a placeholder here. And again, this is just normal HTML, what we're doing here right now. Finally, a button with add. Now, okay, beautiful. So that looks just like here, or very similar. So here we have the 1, 2, 3, so these 3 values. But here in the real app, we have 20. So of course, we don't want to write these 20 options over there by hand, right? So instead, what we do is to, inside of JavaScript, we will create an array with the numbers from 1 to 20, and then we will loop over that array and basically create a list of option elements. So let's do that. And we will use a nice trick, which is called array.from. And it's not really important how this function works. So let's just follow this here. And actually, we will do this all the time in React. So this trick is actually quite important. So as a first parameter here, we can pass in an object with the length property and set that to 20. So that will then create an empty array with 20 elements. And then as a second part, we can pass in basically something like a map function. So that will receive as a first argument the current value, and as a second argument the index. And so here we are only interested in that index, because we will now return that index, which starts at 0 plus 1. And so then we get an array which goes from 1 to 20. And if we wanted, we could just grab this piece of code right here and run it inside of our console, make it a bit bigger. And yeah, indeed, we are missing the key somewhere there, but never mind, we will fix that in a minute. And so indeed, here we get that array from 1 to 20. All right, and now all we need to do is to again use the map method and loop over this to create now a list of these option elements. So again, specifying the value, and now that value is simply num, and we need the key, and that key is also num. So remember how that when we render a list, we need to give each of the elements a unique key. So the number here is of course unique. And then here also num. So give that a save, which makes this a little bit more legible. And so this option is basically just exactly what we had before here manually. But now we create that dynamically here automatically from 0 to 20. So there it is. So since we were speaking of this key here, let's also go to this list and fix the key there. So right here where we have that map, we need to also pass in the key. So that key again needs to be something unique. And what is unique here is this ID property. Well, not yet, but here let's use a 3. And so now these IDs are unique. And so those are the ones we are going to use. So usually when we get an array of objects, each of these objects should have an ID. So that's then the perfect candidate for using here as a key. And again, we will learn later exactly what this key is and why it's so important. But without it, React will always complain. All right, after reloading it, it is gone. And so let's go back to our form. And the form is actually already complete at this point. And so let's now talk about events. So basically what we want to happen is when we click on this button here, we want this form to be submitted. And so we can then react to this form submission with an event handler. So let's do what I just said. First, let's actually create the event handler. And we will do that just like before, right in the component function. So here we create another function, and this one is typically called handle submit. All right, and now all we need to do is to listen for that submit event. So how do you think we do that? Well, we go right here to this form, and then we add on submit. And then all we need to do is to pass in the handle submit function that we just created. And again, really important to understand is that we don't call the function here. So we don't do this. Instead, React will call the function for us as soon as the onSubmit event happens. Now, when exactly is that submit event going to happen? Well, simply as soon as we click here on this button. But for now, of course, nothing is happening because we don't have any logic in our handler function yet. Now, another way in which a form can be submitted is by hitting the enter key while we are here in the submit. So when I'm here and I hit enter, then you see that the form got submitted, actually. So maybe you saw that there was a brief flash of reloading, and that's just the normal behavior of forms in HTML. So that has nothing to do with React. Now let's just do this one more time so I can show you. So writing test and then submitting, watch what happens. So as I told you before, there was like a brief flash and then the page actually reloaded, and so the text that we got here is gone. Now remember that whole conversation about the single page application, where I mentioned that in a single page application like we want to build with React, we usually can submit a form without the page reloading. So in other words, what we want is for this page not to reload. And so we need to disable this default behavior of HTML. So the way we do that is to accept the event here. And then here we can use event.prevent default. And again, this is normal JavaScript right here. So if you're used to working with forms in vanilla JavaScript, then you probably have seen this before. So let's see what happens now when we submit. Yeah, then nothing happens. So that's actually exactly what we want now. We want no reload. So we want to stay here on the same page. So building a single page application. Now what's with this E here actually? How does it get here? Well, as soon as the submit event happens, React will call this handle submit function. And when it does so, it will pass into the function the event object. So an object with all the information about the current event. So again, that's very similar to what happens already in vanilla JavaScript. So here we could also basically write this. So this would be exactly the same, but it's then a bit more obvious what happens. So here, this function gets the event, and then we call handle submit with that event. But that's kind of redundant, so let's remove that. So let's just quickly recap what we did here, which was actually not a lot, but it's still important to understand what happened here. So first of all, we just created our form elements, and then the important part is that we are listening now for the submit event that happens on the form. And that event happens on the form as soon as we click this button or as soon as we hit enter while we are in this input element. And again, that is just some normal behavior of HTML. Now we could also not listen to the submit event and instead listen for onClick right here. So we could do like this, and then, for example, create a function handle click. So instead of handle submit. So that would also work, but it would only work on the click of the button. So that would then not work when we hit enter while here. But we do actually want that. And so let's instead listen for the submit event. And by doing so, we are leveraging the power of HTML forms. Now, the next question is, how do we actually get this data from the form into this event handler, right? Because of course, the goal is to do something with this data. So with this quantity and with this item description. Well, there are multiple ways of doing so. So we could get that data right from the event object. So let's just see. We could log this event to the console. So let's see what happens. So here we get this synthetic base event, and we will talk about what the synthetic event is a bit later. But you see that here we get the target, so basically the element on which the event was fired. And then there we have, for example, the input on which we can see the value. So test is exactly what we have here, right? However, in React, we usually don't do this. Instead, we use something called controlled elements. But that's a topic for a whole new video, and so let's now take a break and come back in a second. Let's now learn about yet another fundamental React concept, which is controlled elements. So let's take a look what they are and how we use controlled elements when working with forms in React. So to start, what we need to understand is that by default, these input fields, like this input and also this select, they maintain their own state inside the DOM. So basically inside the HTML element itself. Now this makes it hard to read their values, and it also leaves this state right here in the DOM, which for many reasons is not ideal. So in React, we usually like to keep all this state in just one central place. So inside the React application and not inside the DOM. And so in order to do that, we use a technique called controlled elements. And so with this technique, it is React who controls and owns the state of these input fields and no longer the DOM. So, since we want to now keep this data inside the application, what that means is that we need some state, right? Because that form data, of course, changes over time, and we also want to maintain our application in sync with it. So, in order to implement the controlled elements technique, we follow 3 steps. First, we create a piece of state. So let's start with that. And we will start here with this actual input element. So with this text field right there. So that field is for the item description. And so we call it description. And then, as always, the setter function is set description. And so then we use the useState hook. So the useState function. And then just like before, when VS Code shows us this auto-completion here, make sure to click here or to hit enter, because that will then automatically include, so it will import this useState hook into this file. So it will automatically include this line of code. And then for some reason that didn't work in your VS Code, then make sure to just write this out by hand. Now the default value for this description can just be an empty string like this. And so now we finished the first step of this technique. So we have our piece of state, and now we use that state as a value of the input field. So we come down here to the input that we want React to control, and then we specify the value, which again is just a normal HTML field. All right, so even in HTML, you can use value and then set it to something. So we could also do just this. All right, but now we don't want that, but instead we want our description. Give it a save, and there we go. Let's just reload to get rid of this. Yeah, here we get another warning, and it's already telling us the third step that we need to take. But for now, let's just see what happens if, for example, here we write now test. So you see now our input field has the value of our state. Okay, and now for the final step, we of course now need to somehow connect this state with the value that we are actually going to type there. Right, because now the state will simply always stay empty, even if we type something here. So React is now controlling this element and always sets it to the description. But the description right now always stays at this empty string. And so no matter what we do, right now we cannot change this. So what we need to do is to also, on the same element, listen for the change event. So that's using the onChange prop. And then here, let's just define an inline function. And this function receives the event that was fired off. So in this case, the change event. And then here, let's just type the code, and I will explain what actually is happening here. So set description e.target.value. All right, and now if we type here, first let's reload again. Now that we type here, it works. And to make this even more visual, let's come back here to our DevTools, and then here in the form, we need even more space. So you see that we have our state of test. And if we write here, then notice how that state down there is updating. So we can write anything, and then basically it will get synchronized with this state that we have in our application. And so now it is in fact React that owns the state and that is controlling the state. But now back here to this line of code. So basically whenever we type something in this field, the change event is fired off. And we can react to that event here with this onChange event handler. And so here we pass in the function, and the function, as always, receives the event. And then on the event, we read target, and e.target is basically this entire element, and then this element dot value is exactly the text that we wrote. And just to make this a bit more visual, because I know that this can be a bit tricky to understand, so I want to make sure that you get it. So let's log to the console also this e.target, maybe. So as I delete now, this will fire off the change event. And so then here we get e.target. So as I hover it, you see that e.target is the entire element indeed. So watch what happens when I set, or when I log e.target.value. So immediately that character that I just typed was logged here to the console. And not just the character, but actually the entire value. So now I write another one, and then now we get t, then test, and then test. And so it is this value that each time that we write something, we set as the new state of the description. All right. So just to drive this home, each time that we type here, we set the state again. So we set it to the string that is currently in this input field, which will then re-render this view. So this entire form here actually. And so then that new state of description will get placed there as the value. So we always need both the value and the change here on the input element. Let's get rid of these curly braces here. Yeah, just like this. And just to see if we actually understood this, we now need to do the exact same thing with the select element. And if you want, you can actually pause the video and try that as a challenge now. So did you try that? Well, if not, that's no problem at all, because we only did this once. So I understand that it's still quite fresh and maybe confusing. But anyway, we now also need to control this select input element right here. So that's going to be the quantity. So let's call that state quantity, and the setter function is set quantity. And then again, use state, and here the default value, we want it to be 1. Let's just say 5 for now, just so we see the effect in the UI. Okay, so that's the first step. Now the second step is to then define the value. And so in this moment, React then starts controlling this element. So value of quantity, well, what was that? And you see, immediately we get this 5. Again, with this, it's easier to see with our DevTools. And yeah, so that's the 5. But of course, if we change this now, then nothing will happen. And so the reason for that is the same as before, because this value is now coming from our quantity state. The DOM is no longer in charge of this value now. The only thing that we now have to do is to give this the ability to change itself. So to basically update the state each time that we change this value here. So that's again using the onChange handler. And this function gets the current event. And here we now do the exact same thing. So we set quantity based on e.target.value. And by the way, this value is coming directly from the option. So right from here. So that's why we need to set the value here inside of each option. Just to make sure, let's give it a save. And there we go. So you see, it changed here, and it also changed here. Maybe you cannot really see this as it's right at the bottom, but yeah, here is the 10. Now what we can see immediately is that this is a string. While in the beginning, when we first load the app, let's try that, we get the 5, but without the quotes. So now this is actually not a string, it's still a number, and that's because we set the default here as a number. But then as soon as we change this, for example, to something, then here we get this string. And so the reason for that is that here e.target.value is always a string. So before we place this value into the state, let's first convert it to a number. And we can do that in a few different ways. We can use the trick of using a plus, or we can be a bit more explicit, for example, using the number function. So I prefer to doing it like this, which makes the code a bit more readable. So give it a save. And now, let's see. Yeah, now we get a number. And of course, still, when we write here, that will also update the state down here. And this was actually an excellent demo to show you how useful really these dev tools are, because they allowed us to immediately spot that we didn't have a number here, but a string. And so with this, we prevented a potential bug in our code. Great. So hopefully you got that. So you understood exactly how that works. So just to quickly recap, the technique of controlled elements basically consists of 3 steps. So we define a piece of state, like this description here. Then we use that piece of state on the element that we want to control. So we basically force the element to always take the value of this state variable. And then finally, of course, we need to update that state variable. And we do so here with the onChange handler, where we then set the description to the current value of that input field. And so with this, it is now this component, so basically it's React, who is in charge of the state and really of the entire element. And so that's the reason why this technique is called controlled element. Great, so that should be clear now. And so let's now go ahead and just quickly use these values here. For example, we can create a new item object. So with description, quantity, also we have the packed state in each of these items. And by default, of course, the items should not be packed. So let's set it to false here. And then we also need an ID. Now we could use some library here to generate that ID, but let's do it quick and dirty here just with date.now. So that should just work here in this case. And then for now, we will just log it to the console. All right, let's go to our console, reload all of this. And actually, let's also set it to 1, which is the default that makes most sense. So let's say that we need 10 shirts. So hit enter and beautiful. So we got our data here from the state and it contains the description. It contains the quantity right here. And then these other data that we just defined. So some random ID and also this packed state set to false. So with this, we learned how we get now this data out of the form. Now, just to finish, let's tweak our handle submit function a little bit. For example, when this happens, so when we submit the form without any item, then still this works. But the description is simply set to an empty string, which is our default here. However, we don't want this to happen. So when there's no description here, then we shouldn't even be able to submit the form. So that's simple enough. We can just add like a guard clause here. So we can say if there is no description, then return immediately. So basically then nothing's going to happen. And again, this is just some normal JavaScript, nothing to do with React. So you see, nothing happens now. But if so, then we get our object. And now finally, usually when we submit a form, then afterwards, once that submission is done, the form should go back to its initial state. So let's also do that. And for that, we can simply use our setter functions, right? And so that's the beauty of React being in charge of the form, because now all we have to do is to update the state, and then this enables React to automatically keep this state in sync with these form elements. So basically, that's the whole idea of the controlled elements. It's to allow React to keep our component state in sync with the state of these DOM form elements. But anyway, let's now do what I just said. So setting the description back to its initial state and set the quantity also back to its initial state. So let's try that one more time. And beautiful. So that worked really, really nicely. So this form is now a lot more real world. It's back to its initial state. And then down here we get the data. But now what do we do with this data? So at some point we will want to actually render this new object here into the user interface. So right here into this packing list, right? So how do you think we will do that? So how can we get this new state, so basically this new object that we just created, into this list? And just as a reminder, this list, well, it's even easier to see here in the component tree. So we have the form, and here is the list. So we want to get the data from this form into this packing list right here. So do you think that we could do that with props? Well, not really, right? Because these are sibling components. The form is not a parent component of the packing list, and therefore we cannot pass props from form into the packing list, right? So because data can only flow down the tree, but not up or sideways. So that was one of the important things that we learned about props. Remember that? So therefore, if we cannot use props in a simple way, we need to find another solution. And so this is where we really need to start thinking more about state and state management. But since this is so important as a React developer, I created an entire separate section about thinking in React. And that section is up next. So what we're going to do now is to take a break in this application and finish this section with a brief summary and a challenge to consolidate our knowledge about how to use state in React. And then after that, we will come back here to this application, and then we will really make it work. So then we will be able to pass data basically from the form into the list. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So make sure to finish the section, and then right afterwards, let's keep going with this application. A very common beginner question, or sometimes even an interview question, is this: what's the difference between state and props? Well, we actually already learned almost everything to answer that question. But let's still make the difference between state and props crystal clear in this lecture, which will also serve as a nice summary to this entire section. So, as we already know, state is internal data, so data that is owned by the component in which it is declared. And we can see that nicely in this small example with two components. Now, on the other hand, props is external data, so data that is owned by the parent component. And you can think of props as function parameters, so as a communication channel between parent and child components where parents can pass data into children. State, on the other hand, can be thought of as the component's memory, because it can hold data over time, so across multiple re-renders. Now, state can be updated by the component itself, and as we already know, this will then cause the component to be re-rendered by React. Therefore, we use this mechanism of state to make components interactive. On the other side, props work very differently. They are read-only, so they cannot be modified by the component that is receiving them. However, and this is something that we haven't learned before, when the child component receives new updated props, that will actually also cause the component to re-render. And let's actually analyze that here in this code example. So one of the props that was passed to question is called upvotes. And that upvotes variable is actually state in the parent component, right? It's created using the useState hook, and therefore upvotes is in fact state. Now, if this piece of state is updated, of course the question component who owns the state will be re-rendered. But it makes sense that the child component who basically receives that state as props should also be re-rendered, right? Because how else would the button component be kept in sync with the state that it received as a prop? So, in conclusion, whenever a piece of state is passed as a prop, when that state updates, both components are re-rendered. So both the component owning the state and the component receiving the state as a prop. And so this is a very important connection between state and props that you should keep in mind. Now, finally, while state is used by developers to make components interactive, props are used to give the parent component the ability to configure their child components. So basically, props can be seen as settings in child components which the parent component can define as they wish. And that's it. So if you ever get asked the difference between state and props in a job interview, I sure hope that you're going to nail it. From my experience, it's not super hard to understand how state works in React, but it can actually be quite tricky to understand how exactly to use it in practice in different situations. But the thing is that this is the #1 skill that you need to have as a React developer. And that's why I decided to create this extra exercise that we're going to build together now to give you more situations and more opportunities to practice. So let's go. And here is the exercise that we're going to build. And it's actually a small project even. So this is a flashcard project where a flashcard is basically a question on one side, and then when you click it, you get the answer on the other side. So imagine that you can like rotate each of these cards here, which is what many people use to study. So if I click here now again, then it will basically turn the card around again. If I click here, then it opens this one. And while this is open and I click on another one, then you see that one closes and this one opens. All right, so this is going to be a small, fun exercise, which maybe looks very complex to you right now, but actually all we need is one piece of state to control all of this. Now I added a starter file to the link of this lecture. So that's this code sandbox here. And so here we already have an array with all the questions. And once again, that's an array of objects. All right, and so what we're going to build is this flashcard right here. So all you have to do is to fork now this code sandbox, or you can just also copy paste this entire code into your own code editor on your computer. So that's your choice. But what I will do is to now fork this, which will basically create a copy in my own code sandbox. All right, and so let's get started. And the first part is to actually render out these different flashcards like this. So basically only the front part, which contains all the questions. So you see that each one has an ID, a question, and an answer. But of course, by default, only the questions are visible. So we already know how to render lists, right? We just enter JavaScript mode, then we take our questions array and map over it. So each of them is a question. And then here we can render some JSX. Now, many times what we do here is to create an extra component. So just like we did in the faraway travel list app that we're currently building, but we don't have to. So we can also just return some JSX here. And so that's what we're going to do now. So just another div. And then in there, a paragraph with the question. So that's question dot question actually. Then let's close that and close the div as well. And there we have it. Now what's missing here is the class name of flashcards. So as you see, I already created some CSS. So if you copied the code into your own computer, then make sure to also copy the contents of this style.css. Okay, now we see that here we have some problems which are related to the key. Exactly, so each one needs a unique key. And so Well, we can just put that here. So key, and then let's use question.id because these are unique values. And as you know, each element that we render here inside the map, so as a list, needs a unique key. So if I reload now, then these errors will be gone. Okay, so we have now our static part all built out. Now what we need to do is something to happen whenever we click on one of these components here, or actually each of these elements. So how are we going to do this? Well, as I said initially, all we need is actually one piece of state. And that piece of state will keep track of which question ID is currently the active question. And if that sounds confusing, then let's just write the code. So let's call this the selected ID and then set selected ID. Use state. And then here we will want to start with null, because by default, we want none of the questions to be open in the beginning. So to be selected in the beginning. And so that's what null is for. So null is basically just nothing, right? So now here we need to import use state from React. All right. And now let's remember the 3 steps of using state, which I like to always come back to, because I think this makes it a bit more helpful to understand how we should approach this. So the first step is to define the state variable, which we already did. Second is to then use that state variable. And third is to update it. So as for the second point, let's now do that. So let's use this selected ID here for something. But well, this time, this is a bit tricky, right? Like, what do we actually need this selected ID for? Well, let's maybe make it easier by, instead of using null here, using one of these. So one of the actual IDs. So 9103. So if this is the state, so let's imagine that we just clicked on this one here. So how to give components memory. Let's say that we just clicked here, and so that this is then the state. So how do we want to use this state? Well, basically here, instead of displaying the question, we want to display the answer. So we can do that. We can say question.id equals the selected ID. And if it is, display question.answer. And if not, well, then of course the question.question. And so now here we actually this time got the answer. So that's the use state hook. And so that's already working. So let's do the same thing for the styling, because here actually this gets like with this red background. And so we can use a class that I created for that and add it here to this div. So let's do something similar then. So class name, enter JavaScript mode, and then we do the same thing. So if the current question ID is equal to the selected ID, then here the class name should be selected. And if not, then nothing. And there we go. So beautiful. Just make sure that you actually understand what is going on here. So as we loop over this array here, each of these elements is one of these divs, right? And in each of these divs, we have access to the current question object. And then each of them has one ID. And so what we can then do is to compare that ID with the selected ID. So the one that we have currently selected. And if that is the same, then, well, it's just what we have written here. So if it is the selected question, so if the selected ID is equal to the one that is in the object, then simply display the answer. And otherwise, in all other cases, well, then display the question itself. so not the answer. All right, and now let's set it back to null. And now all we have to do is to set the state. So that's the third step. So when do we want to update the state? It's whenever we click here. So in one of these diffs. And so that's where we place the onClick handler. So as you see, it doesn't even have to be a button or anything like that. Okay. And now what we are going to do is to create a function here. So just to make our code a bit easier to understand. So let's call it handleClick. So for now, just the name of the function. So here we need to now then pass in that function, right? However, that is not really enough because, well, here we will now call set selected ID. But as the name says, we now here actually need the ID of the question that should become the selected question, right? And so what this means is that this function needs to receive that ID so that we can then set it here. So now we need to call this handleClick function with that ID. So simple enough, question.id. But don't make the mistake of thinking that this is finished. And actually, React already gave us here an error. So remember that here we need to pass in an actual function and not a function call like we have here. So this is calling handleClick immediately. That's not what we want. We want to pass in a function so that React can then call the function as soon as the event happens. Okay, and that should already be enough, at least for now. So that worked. Great. And as I click on another one, then of course, this one becomes the active one. And let's check out the React DevTools, because Code Sandbox actually also has the React tools integrated. So when we come here to the app, or actually flashcards, notice that the state is now 9103, which is exactly this ID. When we click here, it becomes, well, that should have updated, but apparently it doesn't work that great. So yeah, well, maybe never mind. Let's just close this down again. What matters is that it is working, at least kind of, because watch what happens when I click here again. So nothing happens, of course, because here we are simply passing in that ID, and then we are setting that ID as the selected ID. So just as expected. But as we see here, as we click again, it actually closes the card again. So this functionality we already have of changing between cards, but when we click on it, that we don't have yet. So let's do that. And that's not too hard. Basically, what we want to do here is to set this ID based on a condition. So we want to say if the question ID is different from the currently selected one, then the result here should be the ID. And if not, well, then set it back to null. Now here there's some problem. Yeah, I have one equal too much. All right. So again, if the question ID is different from the already selected ID, then set the ID. And so that's exactly this behavior, right? But if not, so basically if the question ID is already equal to the selected ID, then set it back to null. And so with null, then none of them will be active. And yeah, that works. And I think it makes sense as well, right? So this usage of state here was quite a bit different from what we had before. And so that's why I decided, again, to include this exercise here by the end of this section. So please make sure to study exactly what is happening here. And then after that, I think you are ready for the final coding challenge of this section. Let's wrap up this section by continuing to work on the date counter challenge that we started earlier. So in this part 2 of the challenge, we will upgrade the date counter that we built before. So we can still click here on these buttons to move forward in the date, but now we can also directly go to a date by defining a count here. So for example, 1,000 days from now is, well, this one here, or 10,000 or 100,000, and you can keep going as you wish. So let's put it back to 1. And so that is the upgrade here for the counter. And the step is also different. So instead of these buttons that we had before, so similar to these ones, we now have this slider. And so now if we click here, we move up these 7 here. But the 7 was now defined using this nice slider. And this slider is actually just another type of HTML input element. But I will show you that here in a minute. Finally, what we also have is that we can reset. So when we click reset, it goes back to 0 here and back to 1 in the step. And this button is only visible when one of these two changes. So let's go back and let's do that. So here I still have the code from the previous challenge. And what I'm going to do now is to fork this. So this will basically create a copy out of that other one. And so now I can keep writing the code here without changing the initial one. So what I wanted to quickly show you here is that slider. So we can use the input. So as I said, this is now an input and the type is of range. And then we set a minimum value. We can set that to 0 and a max value to 10. Let's see. And there we go. So now this is of course an uncontrolled element now. So right now React is not in charge of controlling this value. And so what you need to do, as you can imagine, is now make this input element a controlled element and then also this one right here. So with this, you will practice what we just learned a little bit earlier, right? And in case you have any doubt, you can just go back to that lecture and check out the code that you wrote there. So let me just show you here the result so you know what you have to build. So good luck with this challenge, and I see you back here in a few minutes once you are ready. All right, let's now quickly supercharge basically our counter component. So most of the things are actually not going to change here. So we already have the step state. All we have to do is to connect it now. So with this input element. So the value of this element should be, of course, controlled by that step state. And then we need the onChange handler just like before. So we get the current event and then we set the step based on that event. So event.target.value. And then we can get rid here of this button. And let's see. Yeah, that works already. And indeed, well, that doesn't really work, does it? So it is adding the 10 as a string. So we have a bug in our code. So the problem, as you can see, is that this value here is taken as a string. So that's actually the problem that we had before and that we detected using the React DevTools. And in fact, the DevTools are also available here. So we could see the same thing here. So the state is 10. So 10 as a string. So we just do what we did before, which is to convert this value to a number before we then place it into the state. So let's reload that here. Take some time. And let's set it to something. And that's working now. And you see here that we have, well, that's not correct really, for some reason. But what matters is that here it's actually working. So maybe the integration here in Code Sandbox is not as good. But yeah, never mind. What matters is that this part is working already. And now all we have to do is to create an input element here as well. So that should also not be so hard. So we no longer need this span, but instead we will use an input of the type text. The value here is count, and then on change, basically we want almost the same thing as before. So we get the current event and then set count, and then this time we're not going to forget the conversion part. So we convert to a number e.target.value. And now all we need to do is to close down this element, give it a save, and yeah, this all looks correct to me. Let's see. Well, something's happening here. Let's close down the React tools maybe. Yeah, anyway, let's just reload here just to be sure. So this works. And now if we input a value here, yeah, nice. So that's really, really nice. So with this, we have a bit more control over the component, and we can calculate dates from now, which is quite helpful. But yeah, let's just review quickly what we did here. So these two input elements are now controlled elements for the same reason that we already saw before. So we have a piece of state, and we then connect that piece of state, for example here the step, with the input element. So we force this input field to take the value of the step piece of state. But that alone is of course not enough, because with that we would not be able to then change here the value. And so we then need to handle the event of actually trying to change, so of sliding here basically. So each time we slide, the change event is fired off. And so then each time that happens, we want to set the step with the current value of the element. So that's e.target.value. Nice. And finally, the only thing that's missing is that reset. So that button right here. So let's then create a button down here. Let's create another div where we place that button into. So reset, close that, and close the div. So we want something to happen on the click, so we use the onClick prop. And now here let's actually do this as a separate function, because here we will need to set two pieces of state. So let's call this handle reset. Now that does of course not exist, so we get this complaint. So let's fix that. Handle reset. And so what's going to happen here? Well, all we have to do is to set these two back to their initial state using their setter functions. So set count will go back to 0 and the step will go back to 1. So yeah, that works. The only thing that's different between the demo that I showed you is that we should not display this reset button when there's actually nothing to reset. So basically what we want to do is to conditionally render this part here. So let's wrap it into a JavaScript block, and then we can say if count is equal to 0, or if step is different than 1. So count different from 0 or step different from 1. So 0 is the default for count and 1 is the default for step. And so if one of these defaults is different, then we want to conditionally render this part. So for that we can again use the AND operator, or maybe just, why not, let's this time use the ternary operator. So in this case, maybe we should just put a parenthesis around this. So just to make sure that this is one condition that gets evaluated first. So in this case, render this, and else render nothing. All right. So as soon as we change this, we get a button, or as soon as we change this, the same. Beautiful. So that's exactly what we wanted to build. And so we are finished with the challenge, and we are finished with the section. And so let's waste no time and let's keep working on the far away list right in the next lecture of the next section.